Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be chatting with you about a topic I'm very interested in, monarchs and their conservation, particularly in grasslands. I want to start off, oh, there we go. My cursor was slow to advance slides. I want to thank Gary for inviting me to give this talk. I want to thank Gary also for organizing the field trip that I had this past Monday to the Fayette Prairie region of Texas. We visited 4 ranches and I learned a heck of a lot and had a wonderful time. I want to thank all the ranchers who allowed me to visit their land. It was a very special opportunity. Also want to thank Marcus Rose, a local soil conservationist with NRCS from Fayette County, who accompanied us and represented NRCS and filled us in on NRCS policies, programs, and practices. He's a great guy and look forward to seeing all of you on a future visit. The Fayette Prairie region of Texas I found to be very beautiful, and it's clearly very important for biodiversity conservation. Whether you're looking at the broad scale at very beautiful landscapes like this and like this, beautiful grasslands, and like this, grasslands loaded with wildflowers, or you're focusing on close-ups of individual wildflowers. This is a region with a lot to offer. It reminded me, surprisingly, a lot of some of my favorite grassland regions in Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma, where I've done most of my field work in the past in those states. Haven't done much in Texas, but I was impressed by the commonality that this region had with those other prairie regions. I want to introduce my employer, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. We are a nonprofit that protects wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. Invertebrates, of course, being animals without backbones. Our main office is in Portland, and we have people scattered all over the country. I also assist the USDA NRCS with their mission. The NRCS, of course, stands for Natural Resources Conservation Service. This is a federal agency, and the mission statement right there in the middle is to deliver conservation solutions so that agricultural producers, in other words, farmers and ranchers, can protect natural resources and feed a growing world. They provide technical and financial assistance. Not all farmers and ranchers qualify for the financial assistance. For instance, multimillionaires or billionaires, they're probably not going to qualify for the financial assistance. They don't need it. But just about anybody who's a farmer or rancher can qualify for technical assistance. And I encourage you to reach out to your local NRCS office. Brief outline of this presentation. I'll give a brief intro on Monarch basics. So Monarchs 101, just to make sure we got the bases covered. And then I'll present advanced info on milkweeds and nectar sources, especially with how it pertains to Texas and Oklahoma. I'll talk quite a bit about managing grassland habitat. And then I'll finish up with a few slides on additional resources, and then the question and answer session. You may have heard that invertebrates are in deep trouble. Many species of invertebrates are declining. In most parts of the world where it has been studied, the diversity, abundance, and biomass of insects and other invertebrates, those factors are decreasing. The monarch is no exception. Look at this bar graph represents the population of monarch butterflies that overwinter in Michoacan, Mexico. And of course, those butterflies are the eastern population of monarchs, which includes the monarchs that live in Oklahoma and Texas. And as you can see, the bars over on the left from the 90s are a good deal higher than the bars of the most recent years. Gary, can you see my cursor move?
Yes.
I can. Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Very good. Very good. I different technologies allow you to do that. Some do, some don't. Good. I'm glad I can use that. Another important basic, of course, is the monarch life cycle. Monarchs, like all butterflies, have 4 stages. The egg stage, the egg hatches into a larva. The larva metamorphoses into a chrysalis. The chrysalis metamorphoses into an adult. This whole cycle can happen in as little as 28 or 29 days, going from an egg that is laid to a egg-laying adult. It's usually not that fast, but in warm weather in places like Texas, it can be that fast. Another basic monarch caterpillars are host plant specialists. They feed only on milkweeds. Milkweeds, of course, are named for their milky sap, and that milk is full of latex, full of compounds that make it very sticky, and those sticky compounds can gum up the mouth parts of monarch larvae and other herbivores, so it provides a physical defense. However, milkweeds are also known for their chemical defenses. Within the tissues of many milkweeds are cardiac glycosides, complex organic chemicals, also known as cardenolides. And what you see here is a general structural formula. All cardenolides have this basic shape. If you remember your days from chemistry or organic chemistry, so they all have this basic shape, but there are numerous different cardenolide molecules, and they differ by the number of oxygens or hydrogens they have, things like that coming off some of the axes. The fact that milkweeds are toxic is very important to the life cycle of the monarch. It turns out that monarch caterpillars are capable of feeding on toxic milkweeds and incorporating those toxins within their tissues, and then those tissues get carried on through metamorphosis to the pupa and then to an adult, so that some monarchs taste terrible due to the cardenolides. And these were photos taken in the 50s or 60s by my former mentor, the late great Dr. Lincoln Brower, who found that yes, monarchs do seem to be involved in a mimicry complex due to their toxicity, which they obtain primarily from milkweeds. One simple fact of butterfly biology and of monarch biology: adult monarchs feed on nectar. We'll be covering this in more depth later. You need to know that monarchs in North America have three main populations: the non-migratory population of South Florida, the western population, which is west of the Great Divide. They breed west of the Great Divide in the spring and summer, and then they spend the winter on the California coast. And then, of course, the eastern population, which spends the winter down in Michoacan, Mexico. And I was lucky enough in 2019 to visit two of the greatest sites in Michoacan to see monarchs, this one being the most scenic in my opinion, whereas this one, El Rosario, has the greatest numbers of monarchs every year. And there were many, luckily, tens of millions of them when I visited in March 2019. Absolutely spectacular place, and I encourage everybody to go there someday. One last basic information that I want everyone to know is that monarchs are habitat generalists. These 8 photos depict 8 different ecosystem types, and you can look at them and get an idea of how they differ. There's ones up on the top I think are maybe most familiar. Down the bottom we have some from the southeast, some pine forest, some swamp, some salt marsh, and then beach. Yes, monarchs do live on beaches. So that's one thing that monarchs have in their favor, that they can use a variety of habitats, as long as those habitats are kept relatively free from pesticides, and as long as those habitats have milkweeds and or nectar sources. So let's start to get into the more advanced part of this webinar. Earlier, I told you monarch caterpillars are host plant specialists. They feed only on milkweeds. So I have a quiz question for you. How many species of milkweeds are there in the United States? Give yourself a few seconds to think. How many different milkweed species have you seen? How many do you think there are? And here comes the answer. There are more than 100 species of milkweeds in the United States, which to me adds such great complexity to work, to study of monarch ecology, and it makes it really fun. I myself have been lucky. I've seen 40 or 50 of those species. I hope to see I hope to see all of them someday, but that's going to take a while. They're scattered all over. More than 100 species of milkweeds. Now another quiz question. What native plant genera, what native plant genus, I should say, do monarch larvae eat? Quiz yourself, please. Now, these are all scientific names, and I know that many of us don't know the scientific names. The answer here is all of the above. If you said A, Asclepius, you're in very, very good company, because there are many books and publications, even by well-respected authors and well-respected societies, very recently saying that the only plants that monarch larvae eat, are in the genus Asclepius, but that is false. They also use other milkweeds, specifically milkweed vines in the genera labeled below. Texas, by the way, is one of the only 2 states that has all of these genera, and I'm pretty certain that Texas has more species of milkweeds when you count all these genera than any state in the Union. Native milkweed genera used by monarchs, of course, Asclepius. We've got a famous one on the left, the bright orange butterfly milkweed, but also Cynancum, which is a vine. All these other ones are vines, and often their flowers are a little bit nondescript compared to the bright orange butterfly milkweed. The genus Matelea or Matalea. Gonalobus, Funastrum is a very beautiful one that I got to see down in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas for the first time in my life. That was amazing. And then finally, the genus Batalius, which grows in the salt marshes along the Gulf Coast. Now I want to focus on the most important milkweeds of Texas with regards to monarchs, which ones get used the most, and they are species in the genus Asclepius. And in the eastern half of Texas, we've got this beauty, which is quite abundant in rangeland and some pastures, green antelope horn, Asclepias viridis. It's also very abundant in the eastern half of Oklahoma, where I live. And close-up another photo showing you the whole plant on the left, and then on the right, the range map. You see that it's a plant of the southeastern quadrant of the United States. Very important. In my opinion, this is the most important milkweed for monarchs in March and April, period. Because when the monarchs come back from Mexico, this is the main thing they use in so much of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Probably the second most important milkweed for monarchs in Texas is this one, spider milkweed, Asclepias asperula. As you can see from the range map on the right, this species has a much more western distribution. Actually, it's the southwestern quadrant of the United States that it occurs in. As you could guess, it's more tolerant of droughty conditions than is green antelope horn. But there are plenty of places where these 2 species co-occur, for sure, especially central Texas and central Oklahoma. These species often get confused. They do look pretty similar. On the left is green antelope horn, and you can see the leaves are fairly wide. They're usually wider than the photo I happen to choose. I apologize about that. Whereas on the right, spider milkweed, Asclepias asperula, has very narrow leaves typically. I have some growing in my garden right now that have leaves more narrow than these. Both species, by the way, have large pods that stick upright, as are shown in the photo on the right. As far as comparing the flowers, green antelope horn on the left has much longer petals. Notice how those yellow-green petals extend well past the purple structures. These purple structures are known as hoods. Each flower has 5 hoods, but the petals are so long that they go well past the hoods, whereas on the right, the petals of Asclepias asperula are a good deal shorter, and they do not go past the hoods. So that is a really good way to tell these 2 very similar species apart. Probably the third most important milkweed of Texas rangeland and pastureland is Zyzotes milkweed, Asclepias enothyroides. This is a photo that I took in the Fayette Prairie at one of the ranches. on Monday, and I was so thrilled to see it there. And this is where it was growing. Some cattle pasture. I believe this site was dominated by Bahia grass. I apologize if I've got that wrong, but I believe this plant here, and perhaps this one here, and this here were Xerces milkweeds growing quite well in cattle pasture. I never leave this species out because it's my favorite plant. Butterfly milkweed is recorded in most counties of the eastern half of Texas. It occurs in more US counties than any other milkweed species. It has a very, very wide distribution, but it is very, very picky with its soil. It really does best with very well-drained soil. So it struggles in heavy soils and can be hard to find because of that. But it is, in addition to being food for monarchs, it is an amazing magnet. The flowers are for many, many pollinators. Okay, earlier I talked about the cardinalides and how there are multiple cardinalide compounds. What you also need to know is that milkweeds differ in their cardinalide chemistry. This is a table taken from a publication by Steve Malcolm. This pub was, as you can see, was from 1991. And in 1992, I began a study of milkweed chemistry for my master's degree at the University of Florida. And this very table was so important to me. I printed this paper and I memorized a lot of these numbers here. I want you to focus on is this column here, the mean column. These are the mean concentrations of cardinalides in different milkweed species. And you can see down at the bottom, we have some with very low numbers, 39, 50, some at the top, which are insanely high, 7,900, and everything in between. But basically, we have a big cutoff right here between number 14 and number 15. Asclepias viridis is much higher in concentration than Asclepias speciosa. And we'll get into that more later. But these milkweeds, yes, they're very different. So you can't say that milkweeds are toxic. Some milkweeds are toxic. Some milkweeds are profoundly toxic, but some milkweeds seem to be not toxic at all. And that's very important. I mentioned that monarchs feed on nectar when they're adults. They use various nectar species, but they do show preferences. Of the thousands of species of flowering plants in Texas, there are only a few, probably fewer than 200, maybe even fewer 100, that they visit very frequently. They tend to be in these families, especially these three on the left, the aster family, which is their favorite family for nectaring, the dogbane family, which includes milkweeds, and the mint family. And I want to show you a very small handful of the best nectar sources, native nectar sources in Texas and Oklahoma. This is a personal favorite of mine, tall thistle, Cercium altissimum. This grows abundantly on my land, and it feeds multiple monarchs and dozens of bumblebees and other bees every year. I believe the species makes it to North Texas. I'm not sure how far south it goes. Happily, on Monday, I got to see this thistle for this first time, Texas thistle, Cercium texatum. This was on one of the 4 ranches that I visited with Gary and the rest of the crew, and had a monarch nectaring. Look at that monarch. It is about as ragged and faded as it can be. That monarch probably is about 8 months old, probably migrated down to Mexico last winter and then migrated back up into Texas. And that photo was taken Monday. There's a good chance that butterfly is no longer with us. But you can see one of its last meals was the delicious Texas thistle. And I want to point out that the native thistles tend not to be invasive in croplands. The thistles we need to worry about are exotic thistles from Europe primarily that can take over croplands and are big problems for farmers. I forgot to include a slide showing that we have a 92-page document on native thistles. Please consider doing a Google search for native thistles, Xerces, and you'll find that document and learn quite a bit about native thistles. They're really good for pollinators. One of my favorite annuals native to Texas and Oklahoma, golden crownbeard, Verbicina and Celioides. And we have many thousands of records of monarchs using this plant. It blooms for a long time, including fall, all the way up to frost. And it is, I know of no other plant that is popular, so popular with a variety of pollinators as this one. Perhaps the most important nectar plant for monarchs in the fall in Texas is this one, frostweed. I have not often been in Texas in the fall, but there have been multiple publications indicating that this beautiful plant with white flowers is used very heavily by monarchs, both where it grows in urban areas, but also in shady areas along rivers, along ponds. I saw some on Monday growing underneath a giant live oak. There was quite a bit of this plant. Very important plant. I want to let you know that Xerces Society maintains a database of different records, database of records of monarchs using different native plants from all over the lower 48 states. And I am the I administer that database. And I encourage you to please report your observations to me. If you have seen monarchs nectaring on native plants in Texas, and you know what native plant it is, or you have photos, maybe you don't know what, can't identify the plant in the photo, please email me, ray.moranz@xerces.org, because I would like more data from Texas and Oklahoma and everywhere else in the US, because I use this data to generate products. One such product is this one. I helped create this document for NRCS, and I encourage y'all to obtain this document as a free download. Basically what it is a list of the dozens of native species that we know monarchs really like in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. But it's also photos and descriptive information for each species. And I'm proud to say that this cover photo was taken in my backyard a few years ago. A monarch on my favorite annual, Verbicina and Celioides. If you do obtain this document, you'll see pretty early on, there's a list of monarch nectar plants that it recommends. This is just part of that list. And then after the list, you'll find species accounts, detailed information on each species so that you can decide whether or not you're interested in buying seeds or plants for your land. Once again, for a free download, search NRCS Monarchs. NRCS Monarchs, and you'll get a website that has a whole bunch of monarch documents by NRCS. Go down to the bottom to the section for Southern Great Plains. NRCS Monarchs is the website, however. Okay, earlier I talked a bit about monarch migration. Very briefly, one special thing to know about monarch migration is that not all monarchs spend the winter. Not all eastern monarchs spend the winter in Michoacan, Mexico. If we look at this map of the US from early March of 2017, you'll see a bunch of red triangles. Those red triangles are indicating where monarchs were that winter. And you'll see that people were finding them all the way up the Atlantic coast to South Carolina during the winter, plenty in Florida, but also along the Gulf Coast of Texas and places like San Antonio and Austin. So that is an area that I'm extremely interested in learning more about. And I actually have a close friend who's about to publish something pretty fascinating about monarch overwintering in the US, but I cannot divulge her secrets. I just have to read the paper when it comes out. Okay, now a major shift in topic is talking about rangeland management with regards to monarchs. And one document that I worked on with colleagues that I encourage you to obtain if you own rangeland or even if you own pasture land is this document shown here on the left. On the right, you see all the authors. All of us in red are Xerces employees and also partner biologists for the NRCS. Jennifer Hopwood, whose name is in blue, is our supervisor. She's with the Xerces Society, but not with the NRCS. But it's a short document, but it took us a lot of time because it's a fascinating and complicated topic. But to find it online, please search for rangeland management and pollinators. Once again, rangeland management and pollinators. And I'm pretty sure this will come up right at the top of that search. Okay, I want to first talk about grazing. Grazing by livestock and rangeland and pasture land. There are risks of overgrazing to monarchs and other pollinators. And one of the biggest risks is that highly palatable wildflowers, that is palatable to livestock, good risk that they will disappear. And on the right, you see a photo of some prairie that I spent a lot of time in Iowa. And this had been very, very intensely grazed down to the level. This site had lots of butterfly milkweed plants, but they were grazed, possibly some of them were grazed to extinction by really, really intensive grazing. So sometimes that happens. That is a risk of overgrazing. However, there are risks of undergrazing because grazing can help, good grazing practices can help maintain grazing, healthy grass, but it can also promote native wildflower diversity. If the cattle or other livestock prefer to eat the grass and leave the wildflowers alone, then that's going to lead to more wildflowers. And that can be very good for monarchs. I said if. This is highly context dependent. It depends on where you are and what livestock you have and how many livestock you have, et cetera, et cetera. But it's an area that's greatly understudied. But one that I'm very interested in. So I do want to show some examples of grazed sites and milkweeds. This is a amazing prairie in northeastern Oklahoma with thousands, just in this photo alone, you can see hundreds at least of green antelope horn milkweed plants that are doing just wonderfully in rangeland grazed by bison. However, a few miles away, there are cattle herds, and there are plenty of green antelope horn milkweeds too. We see some here, 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 and here, but this photo really shows it better. All of these plants with the little yellow-green clusters of flowers, those are green antelope horn milkweeds, very abundant in this cattle grazed system. And an example from Florida, I actually was at this site in 1992 for the first time with Lincoln Brower, my former mentor. And Lincoln discovered this site. It's a cattle pasture where the cattle have eaten the grass to about an inch tall, but the sandhill milkweeds, Asclepias fumistrata, are doing absolutely great. The cattle are not touching them. So a great example, another great example of how well milkweeds can do in cattle country. So if you ask the question, are milkweeds compatible with grazing? It's a very complex topic. As I mentioned before, cardenolides make some milkweeds toxic to vertebrates. Cardenolides are poisons. However, scientists at the USDA have told me that they almost never receive reports of livestock losses due to milkweeds. They get lots of reports of livestock being poisoned by other flat wildflowers, by a few, but not by milkweeds. Why is that? Well, I think three main reasons. Number one, cardenolide concentrations vary greatly by species, as we've already seen. Number two, extremely important, is that cardenolides taste bad. They taste bitter. Now, I've never tasted them, but Dr. Brower had, and he confirmed that they were pretty bitter. And various livestock and other animals indicate that they don't like the taste of cardenolides. So the key point is cattle usually refrain from eating milkweeds with high concentrations of cardenolides. If there are milkweed species that have low concentrations of cardenolides, and we know there are, cattle do eat those sometimes and seem to do just fine. So this chart shows 7 milkweed species and their mean cardenolide concentrations on the right. And at the top, you can see a species that that's in Texas and Oklahoma, Asclepias asperula, very, very high concentration. Asclepias viridis, a very high concentration. But look at the bottom, one of my favorites, Asclepias tuberosa, extremely low cardenolide concentrations. So I think this line is very important, this line that I've inserted. The milkweed species above this line are so toxic, seemingly, that they are protected from grazing by cattle in most circumstances, and they do great in cattle country. Given that asperula and viridis are the most important milkweeds in Texas, that's a really good thing. At the bottom are species that we might actually need to protect from livestock grazing. If you have a ranch with a lot of cattle and you want to introduce these plants, it might not be a great idea because there's a good chance they'd get gobbled up. And there's a study that occurred in Nebraska a few years ago that researchers are working on publishing on. This is one of the northern species, the most important northern species, common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca. That species was very low in cardenolides, and they found many more milkweeds in ungrazed pastures. They found that in grazed rangeland, cattle were eating the milkweeds. They gobbled them up, and no adverse effects on cattle were observed. So interesting distinction, in my opinion. On the left, this is a photo I took in Kansas. On the left, you see lots of butterfly milkweed. You don't see any on the right. I really, truly do. This is due to the impacts of grazing and nothing else, not due to herbicide spraying or anything like that. This occurs for some nectar plants. Butterfly milkweed is actually could be a more important nectar plant for monarchs than as a host plant. I really should have an example that shows the opposite, because there are many nectar plants that actually do better in grazed systems than they do in ungrazed. It's a complex topic that needs more study. So to sum up grazing and best management practices for it, if you want to help monarchs and you have livestock, please allow time for plant recovery. Use the proper stocking rate. But you might be wondering, what is the proper time for recovery? What is the proper stocking rate? This is going to be highly context dependent. I can't answer it for you. I could try if I visited your site, but I'm not going to be able to visit your site in most cases because I cover a big area, much of the central US. So consult with your local NRCS staff. Ideally, once they know that you're interested in helping monarchs, they will base their advice to you on the ability of milkweeds to grow and nectar plants to flower. They will come up with grazing prescriptions that will allow you to both make money off cattle gains, but also have milkweeds and flowers for the monarchs. Now I'm shifting to fire. The direct effects of fire on insects pretty much always bad. Fire can incinerate insects, particularly the eggs, larvae, and pupae that can't escape. However, there can be some really good indirect effects of fire. Fire can kill invasive trees, it can increase milkweed abundance, can increase flower abundance. And thus far, some of the studies I've seen that looked at the effects of fire on adult monarchs have all been positive. Swengel 1996, Moranz et al. 2012, work that I did in Iowa and Missouri, Leone et al. 2019. We all found that monarchs were more abundant in burned prairie than unburned prairie. Well, why do you think that is? I have my ideas. And I have to ask you, when does most fire happen in prairie country? That's me lighting a fire in Iowa, and you can tell by the appearance of the vegetation, it's winter time. Fires are very, very commonly applied in winter or very early spring. Where are monarchs? Where are most of the monarchs in winter or very, very early spring? Well, they're hanging out in the trees in beautiful Michoacan, Mexico. So the burning that we do in winter will not kill monarchs because they're not around for the most part. Also important to know, I need to move, try to move something. Oh, there we go. Dormant season burning increases the abundance of some milkweeds. I have research that I haven't published yet, but I hope to get working on it again in the next few weeks. We had really positive impact of dormant season fire on this milkweed. Okay, I'm having trouble. Grow. There we go. Does fire impact green antelope horn? I suspect very positively dormant season fire, but I haven't seen research on that. I have seen research on summer burning by Kristen Baum and her graduate student here at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. Asclepias viridis goes dormant in summer. It's blooming now, but goes dormant in summer. However, if you burn in the summer in Oklahoma, and people have told me in Texas as well, if you burn, the Asclepias viridis plants break dormancy and send up new shoots in July and August. Kristen found prescribed fire in July greatly increased both the milkweeds and the monarchs. By the way, the same thing happens if you mow Oklahoma prairie in July. So summer burning, summer mowing, if you mow just once, can be quite positive for milkweeds and monarchs. Fire also can increase floral production, not of every species, but it really greatly enhanced the floral production of these two great monarch plants. I took these photos in Missouri about almost 20 years ago. Pale purple coneflower, tall blazing star. These were prairies with tens of thousands of these plants per acre. It was magnificent. And both of these sites had just been burned a couple months beforehand. So if you aren't lighting fires, you should strongly consider it. Now, I ask you, what's missing from this bucolic scene? We've got wild horses. We've got beautiful grassland. What's missing? Well, I don't see any monarchs, but maybe they're hanging out in the grass. The other thing we're missing, there are no wildflowers here. This is native prairie. This happens to be a 100,000 acre ranch of native prairie that's never been tilled. And it never will be tilled because it's in the Flint Hills, which is covered with rocks, which would blunt any plow. It had a lot of wildflowers 200 years ago, but it doesn't have them now because this 100,000 acre ranch is being sprayed with herbicides to kill all the wildflowers via airplanes. That's very sad for the monarchs and other pollinators, and it's not even helping the rancher, according to research by my mentor, Sam Fuhlendorf, that came out in 2009. They measured the effect of broadcast herbicide on the production of forbs, grasses, and cattle weight gains. And the key things to realize are that herbicides killed forbs, slightly increased grass production, but had no effect on livestock gains. In other words, the ranchers spent a lot of money to buy herbicides to ruin pollinator habitat with no measurable benefit to their livestock. So we at Xerces, I'm trying to scroll one more time. Don't know why it freezes up on me. But it's really done at this time. There we go. We ask you, please don't spray your native forbs. Livestock eat many nutritious forbs that are great for monarchs and other pollinators. We do encourage folks to use targeted applications of herbicides on invasive exotics to control those, but please follow the label directions. Please don't spray the milkweeds. Leave the milkweeds for the monarchs and the other pollinators. Okay, the last two segments, I'm going to talk very briefly about Farm Bill programs. The Farm Bill is, of course, what helps give NRCS its mission. The most important NRCS programs for monarchs, again, I use the word programs, are EQIP and CSP. EQIP stands for Environmental Quality Incentives Program. CSP is for Conservation Stewardship. What's the difference? They're both very large programs. EQIP is bigger, in other words, has more funding than CSP, but they're both very important. EQIP is for farms and ranches that have a major problem that needs to get solved. The problem is called a resource concern, and NRCS will come to your farm and ranch, and they'll determine if there's a resource concern, and if there is, they can provide technical assistance on how to address that resource concern, and that's covered through EQIP. They come out and major problems, but they see that you're already doing good work to conserve, they might support your work through CSP, the conservation stewardship. It's a way of rewarding good behavior, good management, and enabling you to do more good management on your farm or ranch. And the most important practices that are funded for monarchs in our region are brush management, prescribed burning, and prescribed grazing. And secondarily, NRCS will help fund range planting, which is the planting of grasses and some wildflowers on your land, or wildlife habitat planting, which enables you to plant some grasses, but a much higher percentage of wildflowers. That one is really pretty fantastic for monarchs, but of course it can be fairly costly due to the price of seed. NRCS will help with the cost, can help with the cost if you are eligible. So I want to give an example from Stillwater, Oklahoma. Our land, our 10-acre farm / ranch. In September 2018, we still had thousands and thousands of cedar trees. What you see right here, if you went into those cedar trees, which would not be easy, but I did it, down at the bottom, you see a lot of shade, and you don't see much of anything else growing because it's too shady and too dry because those cedar roots were taking all the water. It was, biologically speaking, almost a desert. There were cedars and very little else. However, EQIP, NRCS folks recognize that as a resource concern, and EQIP, I could have gotten funding. I did apply for funding for EQIP. I didn't get it, but a state agency helped me in the same way and gave us some financial assistance to cut down some of those cedar trees. And when we did, we already improved our habitat for monarchs. And then I planted some wildflower seeds and had tons of nectar sources for monarchs. I don't have any slides to show you, but my wife and I applied for CSP funding 2 years ago from NRCS, and we were awarded that funding. And through that, we have been doing prescribed burns on our land and planting cover crops. And this coming winter, we will be planting grass and wildflower seed to help monarchs. And it's a lot of work, but it's very, very fulfilling work that my wife and I get from NRCS. So where can you get more information? Want to learn more about milkweeds in Texas? Single best that there will ever be. This wonderful book by Jason Singhurst, Ben Hutchins, and Walter Holmes covers all of the native Asclepias species of Texas. And there are quite a few, as you can see. I think Texas has more Asclepias than any other state. Plus, it covers one exotic species, tropical milkweed. It's a wonderful document. And this is a free download online. Once again, there we go. Xerces Society, our website, that is, xerces.org, has many, many documents to help you with monarch conservation, conservation of other pollinators and other invertebrates. Lots and lots of great fact sheets and brochures that are free downloads. So I encourage you to go to xerces.org to download some stuff. This is a fact sheet that I helped create. Some of the most common milkweeds of Oklahoma and Texas. Again, this document pales in comparison to the book I just showed you from Singhurst et al., but it's still pretty nifty. It's a simple 2-page fact sheet. To find it, search the web for milkweeds of Oklahoma and Texas. We also have regional monarch nectar plant guides. The Xerces Society does, so you can go to our website and look for these. We have a YouTube channel, and you can connect with the Xerces Society on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Takeaway messages for you: the Great Plains grasslands, particularly our native rangelands, are really great habitat for monarchs and other pollinators. The Xerces Society has developed BMPs for ranchers and rangeland managers, and USDA NRCS has programs and practices to help folks improve monarch habitat on rangeland and pasture land. I want to acknowledge the supporters of the Xerces Society. Most importantly, the ones listed first is the members of the Xerces Society, which are spread throughout the country and hopefully throughout the world, plus our corporate sponsors and various other nonprofits and agencies, including the NRCS. Donors make it possible. We are a donor-supported group, so I encourage you to become a member today to help support us, to keep us going strong. If you want to contact me, feel free to email me at either of these 2 addresses. And at this point, I'm happy to take questions.